encountering stairs, so I don't want anybody to trip, so just watch where you're going, make sure you don't misstep or anything like that. And please, oh, there we go, that's the last one, R9. Anyway, so also please feel free to take as many photos as you like as we're walking around. The spaces we're going through are pretty cool, so snap away. We'll go ahead and get started. We're going to be heading down toward boiler rooms, but that does require us to get down to A deck first, right this way. So before we even continue on into the engineering spaces, there is an engineering feat that you can see right here on A deck. If you turn and look down the corridor, you'll notice that once the main cart moves, you won't be able to see the other end of the corridor because of that very distinct curve to the deck. That's actually intentional. It is called shear to deck. So it means that all of the interior decks of our ship have a curve to them to match the curve of the outside. It gave her extra flexibility as she was crossing the Atlantic. It allowed her to bend and flex without warping any of the flooring. Now, they don't really design cruise ships like this today because it's a huge pain. It means that none of the doors or windows are the same size or shape as each other. So everything is custom built to the angle of the deck. Right this way. It's called the Cunard Story, and it covers the company history of the company that originally owned the Queen Mary. Okay, our elevator is here, right this way. We have just a couple of people. That we had on board. It was like a big haunted maze type thing that ran throughout the ship, and it ran through the boiler rooms, so we still have some of the leftover paint up, as well as some of the fake cobwebs. So that's what you're going to be seeing when the doors open down below.
Nice.
So you will, when we reach the bottom, see a sign in boiler room 2 that says we're 36 feet below sea level, or 6 fathoms. We're actually more like 21 feet below sea level. We sit a little bit higher in the water than we used to. Plus, we're walking on this concrete walkway that wasn't here originally. So I'd just like to stop and give everybody a chance to take a look at this, because it gives you a good idea of how our boiler rooms were set up. Plus, this is a good stopping point for me to cover a little bit of the history of the ship before we start digging into the engineering portion. Throughout the tour, if you folks have any questions, please feel free to ask. Although keep in mind that I am not an engineer. In fact, I switched my major from engineering because I hate math. So just keep that in mind if you have questions to ask. I'll do my best to answer them, but If they're really technical, you're probably going to get guesswork. But the Queen Mary was originally owned and operated by the Cunard Line. And since 1839, Cunard had an agreement with the British government to haul mail back and forth from Europe to North America. This is what gave her the title RMS Queen Mary. It stood for Royal Mail Ship or Royal Mail Service. The plans to build this ship began in 1926, and she and her sister ship, the Queen Elizabeth, were going to be the two largest and fastest passenger liners in the world. This ship would set sail on May 27th, 1936, and she would continue passenger service from Southampton, England to New York City with a short stop in France to drop off mail. It only took her about 4 to 5 days to cross the Atlantic, and she would be so fast that she would actually earn the Blue Ribbon, or the Blue Ribbon Prize, awarded to the fastest ship in the seas. 1939, her peacetime service was cut short due to World War II, and eventually she would actually be drafted into war service and would serve as a troop carrier, hospital ship, and bride and baby shuttle. Due to her immense speed and the gray color that she was painted during the war, it made her pretty much uncatchable, and that would earn her the nickname the Gray Ghost. And the Emperor of Japan, as well as Hitler, put out a bounty on this ship of $250,000 plus the Iron Cross with oak leaves. But by the time a German U-boat spotted us, lined up their shot, and fired, we were already long gone thanks to our engineering. Wartime service completed, the Queen Mary got restored to her former elegance. She would sail for another 20 years, known as the stateliest ship on the seas. But by the 60s, all passenger liners were losing money. The Queen Mary was no exception, so she was retired and auctioned off. Normally, she would have gone to a scrapyard, but the highest of the bids came from the city of Long Beach at $3.45 million. So that's how she ended up here. She would arrive here December 9th, 1967, and we would convert her to what you see today: floating hotel, tourist attraction, convention center. And we would open our doors to the public in 1971. And then in 1993, we would get placed on something called the National Register of Historic Places with Historic Significance, which means if any of the original material you see while you're walking around today breaks or wears out, we actually have to find that same type of material in order to make replacements. So it makes it kind of difficult. The Queen Mary has been part of Long Beach's history longer than she ever sailed. She sailed for about 31 years, and December 9th marked the 52nd anniversary of the Queen Mary's arrival in Long Beach. So we're starting in on her 53rd year with us. So there you go, folks, timeline of the ship. You will probably get more questions answered if you take the Glory Days history tour later on today. But before we get moving on, are there any questions?
I'm a Glory kind of guy. How many people died down here?
We actually don't have anybody, we don't have record at least of anybody dying down here.
Isn't there like where they kept all the patients or people who were sick? Wasn't it down here somewhere?
No, that was up on B deck. That was the isolation ward, but it didn't end up getting used as the isolation ward all that often because we didn't have that many sick people travel on board.
How many people just jumped off deck?
I don't have a number on that one.
So nobody died down here?
No, not that we're aware of.
Ah, okay, yeah. Okay.
All right, break this down. We used to have the special effects tour run with here for some legends. So this section was used to simulate a hull breach, like there was water flooding the ship. So this water is that leftover special effect. So the bulkheads or walls that you see here are actually not the original ones, but if you look up closer towards the ceiling, that is the original bulkhead back there. So we built kind of a false wall in order to have tanks that would then fill up this room. So we are currently standing in what's called the water stopping plant. If you look over here, this gives you kind of an idea of what the room looked like originally. This space was used to treat all the water that the Queen Mary was using. So we would have treated 700 tons of fresh water daily, and that water would have been going towards drinking water as well as water being used in our 24 water tube boilers. We needed to distill that water as much as possible because if there were any minerals left in the water, it would cause a build up in the pipes and potentially cause it to fail. And we didn't want that to happen, so it was imperative that we clean that water up as much as possible. We also treated 25 tons of ocean water in here every hour.
What kind of water? I'm sorry.
Ocean.
Oh, ocean.
Ocean water, yeah.
I just said abortion.
No, ocean water, so salt water. We couldn't really take the salt water and convert it all the way into fresh drinkable water, but we could clean it up enough to be used for what was called sanitary salt water, and that actually would have been used in our plumbing as well as for swabbing the decks and things like that. I don't know if any of you folks happen to be hotel guests, but if you are, you've probably noticed that in the bathrooms there are 4 different taps in the bath: hot and cold fresh water, hot and cold salt water. And that is because the Queen Mary had to carry all of her fresh water with her as she was sailing, and we didn't want to run out of it because people kept showering in it. So we encouraged people to shower in the sanitary salt water and then rinse quickly in the fresh. So that was another use for the sanitary salt water treated in this room. We would have treated this water using both a quartz-based and a lime-based filtering system. We'll go ahead and continue on with the boiler room.
Parang may nakita akong tao dun.
So we are staying in boiler room 1. This was the smallest of our 5 boiler rooms. You probably noticed that the front of the ship kind of comes in at a point. So the shape of the ship did mean this room became a little bit smaller. So it used a different kind of boiler than the ones used in the rest of the boiler rooms. This used a double-ended Scotch boiler. They were 17.5 feet in diameter and 22 feet long. And the rest of our boiler rooms would have had 6 boilers in them each, but because this one was smaller, it only had 3. This was an older design of boiler, and it was obviously cylindrical in shape, and it weighed about 9 tons. Now, if you look up above us, you can see some ductwork here and the left side here. That is left over from the closed stokehold system. So the Queen Mary wanted to burn their fuel as efficiently as possible. So all of these rooms were actually pressurized. So if you look over here, you can actually see an airlock. So if you wanted to transition between boiler rooms, you would have transitioned in airlocks so as to keep the pressure. This closed stokehold system were basically kind of giant draft fans that forced air into this room, and air tried to find the easiest route to escape, and that meant trying to escape via the fire that was boiling the water to create steam, burning our fuel. We'll go ahead and continue on. So now we are in boiler room 2. This is about the standard size for the rest of our boiler rooms.
Let me ask a question.
Yes.
These are all blocked off? Do they have doors to come through? Or?
Yeah, so these big open spaces that you see here would not have been here originally. The reason they're all cut out the way they are is because when the ship was retired, the agreement with Cunard, the company that owned our ship, was that she would never again sail under her own steam. So we had to convert her to a floating building. And that required us to remove all of her boilers, one of her engine rooms, and 3 out of her 4 propellers. And in order to lift all the pieces of the boilers out of this space, we had to cut out these walls here, as well as shear off the stacks at the top of the ship so that we could lift out the boiler pieces through those empty spaces. So the stacks that you see at the top aren't actually the original. They're replicas of what would have
That's huge.
Yeah. The boilers here were cube-shaped Yarrow boilers, which were 23 feet by 23 feet by 23 feet. So it was pretty big. If you worked in here, you had to be a pretty tough individual. First of all, you had to be okay with heights. If you look kind of straight above us here, as well as off to the side, you could see some of those original catwalks that people were walking on. You can see another one right back here on the wall. Yeah, so as you can see, they're very narrow, and they go all the way to the ceiling. Wow. Yeah.
Good luck.
Yeah, so the people working down here generally probably would have been smaller in stature. Probably also would have had to have really good balance because you definitely didn't want to fall off those things.
Look at the tiny little ladder.
Yeah.
That's crazy. Sounds like something that your kid uses to go up on a bunk bed.
Yeah, it does. So you had to deal with those heights and the narrow walkways. You had to deal with the heat down here. Depending on the season you were sailing in, the temperature down here could be from about 92 degrees to 115 degrees Fahrenheit. You would have had to work in those warm temperatures in long sleeves and long pants, because if you were to bump into a pipe unprotected, you would have burned yourself pretty badly. You also had to wear these special wooden soled shoes, because if we wore the rubber soles like we all are today, the heat would have actually started to corrode the rubber over the course of your shifts in this space.
So you got hot feet.
Yeah. That's also why the walkways are slatted versus just a flat one. We do get the question a lot with, especially if it's younger kids on the tour, asking why it looks like a sideways ladder. And that's because if we had just had a flat surface, it basically would have acted as a frying pan with all the heat in this space. So the slats allowed the heat to kind of go through.
Well, there's baby top down or something like that. I had serious money.
Surprisingly, they did not get paid all that well. Usually the people working down here were working down here because they were passionate about what they did. And then as far as shifts went, you would have worked 4 hours, had 8 hours off, worked another 4 hours. Which doesn't sound too bad, but if you worked much longer than 4 hours, it was so taxing down here between the pressure, which wasn't too bad, but it kind of was the same deal as when you're flying in an airplane and you have to pop your ears. The heat, as I mentioned, down here, as well as the noise level, it was so loud down here because of the roar of the fires and the boilers that you could walk up to somebody and yell as loud as you could, and they would still have no idea what you were trying to say to them.
Wow.
So you had to put up with all of that, and then you also had to be cautious about the steam itself, because when it was, if there was a leak, it was so hot and pressurized that it would take about 10 feet away from the pipe before any sort of visible cloud started to form. Stumble into that unprotected, and to prevent that from happening, men would be armed with a broom that they held out in front of them, and then when the bristles at the end of the broom started to move, they knew that they had encountered a leak and then could set about repairing it.
That's good.
You'll also notice on the walls when you have these black streaks coming down. So that's not paint, that's actually leftover fuel. So the Queen Mary was not coal-fired like the Titanic. We used something called bunker seed fuel oil. So it's all the molasses-like stuff at the bottom of a barrel of oil when you're done refining it. And you actually had to heat it up to, I think, 700 degrees just to pump it through the pipes to make it liquid enough to use. And it was really hard to pump it all out of our system, so we actually still have a lot of it floating around in the pipes. And those black streaks are where the fuel has kind of started to leak through over the years.
It's not fun.
No, not anymore.
Did anybody try to light it?
I hope not.
Make sure it wasn't flammable.
As far as I know.
None of us ever lighted it.
Okay, good.
This is something original? This little thing right here is original?
We're not entirely sure what it is.
don't want to touch it.
So the power coming from boiler room 1, so the first boiler room that we came through, would have been coming here as well as to the aft turbo generator room. This room supplied all of the electricity for the passenger areas of the ship, so it would have ran the lights, the elevators, the kitchens, anything that would have been used to make our guests feel comfortable. That's what would have been pumped out in here. This would have been producing about 1,300 kilowatts per hour. We also had another turbo generator room further back, and combined, the two of them would have produced about 9,100 kilowatts. That is about enough to power a city of 100,000. So, today, that number doesn't sound very impressive because we're used to cities of like 500,000 to 1 million people.
That's like a zip code.
But one of my coworkers likes to put it in these terms. There was enough power coming out of this room into the lights back up in the passenger areas that when you were walking around Main Hall, which is where Tour Center is, where you checked in, you could actually hear the lights humming because of all of the electric power getting pumped out here. Here, right this way.
I wonder why it's faster.
Yeah! These original catwalks. They're a little bit easier to see in here so close. This is boiler room number 3. So if you folks are interested in how the smoke from burning our fuel exited these spaces, boiler rooms 1 and 2 would have gone through the forward smokestack. 3 is sitting inside of the ship. We would have been about 21 feet below that. Yeah, when we were in the boiler room. As far as I know, we have never had a leak from the outside of the ship. It's all been internal stuff from plumbing getting old.
So how long would it take us if we had a leak? Very slowly.
It depends on how big the leak was. I don't think it would have been too much of a problem. We would have been able to safely, unless we were like torpedoed. But I don't think that's very likely these days.
Deep sea diving, you only go about 15 feet on the first time.
You'll also notice that some of the rivets that are used to hold the Queen Mary together, some of them are kind of flat and flush to the side of the ship, and some of them further up stick further out. We're still not entirely sure why that design happens. We think maybe it has something to do with reducing the drag of the water on the lower decks. Yeah. That's, we think, also why a lot of the panels are overlapped, is to minimize the amount of drag. Yep, 21.
Somebody would take the gun check.
The Queen Mary's original anchors. This is actually her spare anchor. This weighs about 16 tons. Apparently it would not have been kept on the ship. It would have been kept in port in case one of her other ones was lost. We're going to go ahead and continue down the stairs here into the engine room. Just watch.
Now how far are we going underwater?
We're not underwater right now, but we will be when we go into the engine room. I think it'll be about the same as the boiler rooms.
22.
Yeah, 21. Yeah.
21 feet under seawater. My ears are popping.
No, this is a different area. Earlier, we're in the front of the ship. This is the engine area.
So when we were in the boiler rooms, we saw how the steam was created. Now that we're here in the engine room, I'm going to show you how it was used. So the steam would get pumped back here to the engine room via the high pressure head steam pipes that you see here on either side. And then it would have come through here, high pressure head, into the high pressure head turbine. We would then slow down the power of that steam and kind of harness it, and it would move into the first intermediate pressure head turbine. The same process would happen there, and then it would snake around and come here to the low pressure head and the stern turbine. So the second intermediate pressure head and high pressure astern, these ones are actually the same thing. We have 2 engines in this space, so we would have had 4 engines total, 1 for each of our propellers, and it would have been 2 per engine room. So basically these 2 sides are just mirrors of each other. The reason that one is red and this one is black is just because we took the heat shield off of that one. So the steam would snake its way through, come here to the second intermediate pressure head turbine, and then it would go further back into our other sections of the engine room, which we'll get to when we get down there. We could put the ship into reverse, and that's where a high pressure astern turbine would come in handy. So there's 2-in-1 combination for these, where you see the pipe kind of coming out at a right angle here. That would have been the astern turbine, and that's where the steam would have gone to put the ship into reverse.
Do you know the material that the turbine was made out of?
I believe it's been manganese bronze, because that's what we use for our propeller shaft and propellers.
Money, money, money. And all that was pressurized, but all that electricity came from that.
It would have been the one that we saw, and then there was another one that got removed in the process of converting this whole space into a museum area. So it would have been 2 rooms. So this is the control panel. This is where all the communication happened for the engine rooms. The things marked F, those were telegraphs. So there is an identical set up at the bridge if you folks go and visit up there. And you could operate the propellers at different speeds. I don't know if we ever did, but it was possible. And the way these telegraphs worked is that the people up at the bridge would move the handle of their telegraph to the speed they wanted the propeller to go. So as you can see over here, they are signaling that the port inner propeller needs to be going at dead slow speed. So this little green arrow would move down here to match where the handle at the bridge was. Then the folks down here would open or close the valve depending on how much steam they needed, how fast they were going. And once the correction was made, they would then move their handle to match this green dead slow arrow. And then the green arrow up at the bridge would move to match the dead slow as well. And that would indicate to the bridge that their orders had been followed. You'll see another telegraph here right in front, and that was used to communicate with the boiler rooms. So as you can see, there's excessive white smoke and excessive black smoke, and that has to do with how efficiently we were burning our fuel. We wanted to make sure that we were burning the correct mixture of air and fuel. So if it was excessive black smoke, we were burning too much of our fuel, we were burning it too fast. If there was excessive white smoke, then we were burning too much air and not enough fuel. So I was just trying to find that balance, and the engineers in the boiler room would make their necessary corrections as well.
Question.
Yes?
What's that big red thing up there?
That would have indicated how far the ship was yawing or leaning one side to the other.
Okay, so make sure it's steady.
Yeah. as stable as possible.
Too much pressure on one side.
And then they were able to communicate with these phones?
Yes, so these are called Loudaphones. They're basically telephones, but they were specially fitted to cancel out the excess engineering noise in here. So those would have been used if the bridge had a more complicated order to give out instead of just go fast or go slow. So if it was more complicated than that, then they would have used those telephones.
They've been doing noise reduction forever. So we thought this was some new thing for noise reduction in your car. You got noise reduction in your phone. You thought this was like new stuff. It's been going on since.
Yeah, since the 1930s at least.
Ain't that true?
Here, we'll go down the stairs here.
How far we going up now?
Yeah, when we reach the walkway down here, we get that 21-foot level again. So over here, these are reduction gear. So you can almost think of this like gears on a bicycle, where even though your wheel is spinning at a certain speed, you don't have to pump your legs at that speed. Although this one actually would have been used in reverse, because we weren't trying to speed up our propellers more, because they could only handle going at a certain speed before they started to warp and get damaged. So this actually would have harnessed that really, really fast speed and then slowed it down back for our propellers. And this used a herringbone pattern to make it easier for the gears to lock together as they were turning. And this would have been filled with mineral oil. So this whole engineering space only would have taken about 5 to 6 engineers to operate it. One of the positions was called a greaser, and they were the folks that worked down here to make sure everything stayed oiled and was running smoothly, and it would be their job to make sure that there was enough mineral oil in here that it wasn't causing any friction or anything like that. As we're heading back, if you look up in either side here, you can see some of the little turbine blades. So right here. So this was a turning gear. This was used to warm up or pull down the ship just to make sure that the propeller shaft through this area didn't sag or warp because of the heat difference. It turned pretty slow. As you can see here, it only turned once about every 10 minutes. You'll also course of her career. And actually our first set of propellers were a lot larger than the one you see here, but it created such a vibration in the ship that they switched to the smaller propeller. This is about 18 feet in diameter, and it weighs about 32 tons. It's made out of manganese bronze, and the company promise was that it was so perfectly balanced that when the ship was dry docked, you could tap one of the blades and it would complete a full rotation.
Good. So let's try it.
Well, we can't anymore because there's water in there. But to give you guys a little bit of reference for how large the propeller is, since it's hard to tell, that fairing cone here is what is attaching the propeller out here. Right this way.
Wow.
That's the propeller. It's a big one.
As you can see, people have turned this into a wishing well.
Yeah.
We wish they wouldn't. We specifically built this big shadow box around the outside so that we can suspend the propeller in fresh water, because the minerals in the salt water were causing corrosion to the propeller. But the change people keep tossing in there We donated several trash cans worth of change to Ronald McDonald Charity House, and we also found 12 cell phones down there. So if you're taking pictures, you'll holding on to your items nice and tight. Right this way. So this is a sledge wrench. It's also known as the propeller securing nut wrench. Back by the fairing cone, you saw that big nut, which would have been holding the propeller onto the ship. This is what was used to secure the securing nut. The reason we also call it a sledge wrench is because it would have taken several men using sledgehammers hammering on the wrench in order to make it tighten the securing nut. So as you can see here, we have kind of a slopey side, so you can see where it got hammered down over the years of use. All right, right this way.
That's original.
Yes. I don't know if it's original to our ship, but it's 1936 era. So, before we wrapped up, I wanted to give you an idea of just how much we covered on this tour. So we started kind of in this area on M deck. We walked all the way forward to A deck here, and then we came all the way down through our parking garage into the water softening plant that you see here. And then we worked our way through boiler room 1, boiler room 2, the turbo generator room, and boiler room 3. Then we came back up and over, and then walked all the way back to engine room number 2 that you see here. We did our whole walk around in here, and then we walked along the length of the propeller shaft down here and came out at 180 over here, our propeller. And now we're back here somewhere, right about here at the second class swimming pool. So congratulations, folks. In an hour, you walked pretty much the full 1,019 and a half feet of the Queen Mary.
Woo! Yep. You made it fun. You made it fun. Bravo.
Thank you all so much for coming to the Queen Mary and for taking Steam and Steel. I also want to thank you for being patient with me. This is only the second time that I've done this tour. You folks have access to the engine room if you want to go back and read some of those plaques in more detail. The next 4D showing, which comes included with your ticket, will be at 2:30. And then you also have access to the Winston Churchill exhibit right behind us here. Otherwise, if you're looking to get to your other tour, you'll go back out the glass doors and across the bridge we came down. Any other questions or directions? I'll be here a few minutes. Otherwise, you're free to go. I hope you have a great
Got
rest
a
of your
question.
day.
What is
Yes.
the second, was it the first class swimming pool, because you said second class swimming pool?
Yeah,
So what was the difference between the classes of swimming pools? Was it per capita or what was it?
Just that first class passengers were allowed to use the first or second class pool, but second class passengers were only allowed to use the second class swimming pool.
So did you have like a third class? Because that's probably where I would have
We did not have a third class swimming pool, although eventually in the 60s we did reach the agreement that third class could use the first class swimming pool while first class passengers were at T. Then the pool would be drained, cleaned, and refilled.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
That was crazy. Drain, filled again because of being the post. That's crazy. Wow, how long did that take? What, a couple of hours?
It actually didn't take that long. I think at most it was half an hour.
And what was it, salt water?
Yeah, and we had condensers in the engine room that were filled with these tiny little tubes filled with freezing seawater. So then the steam, once it got used, could go into those condensers and cool back down to water and then be reused. So eventually, though, all of those little tubes filled with water would heat up and the ocean water would be too warm to cool down the steam, and then that would get used in our swimming pools.
So they got the chance to use the water anyway, just a little filter. It was all recycled.
Yeah, we recycled as much as we could.
You still swing third class. That's what that is.
Hauntings. If you have a cell phone, it would be greatly appreciated if you turn those to a silent setting so they do not interrupt the tour. And if you brought a camera, feel free to take pictures along the way. But as we make our way throughout the ship, please try and stay together. The Queen Mary is a large, confusing ship, and sometimes people do go missing. As long as we stay together, that should not be an issue. In short, if I am walking, you should be walking. If at any point I start to run, try to keep up. We'll begin our tour in the Mauritania room, on deck below. Please follow me.
You ready?
Right here.